All right. So, for everyone who just joined, hello, and thank you for coming today. My name is Braden Savage, and with me is Evie Lemieux and Heather Padilla. We are from Kanilehua, Hilo's art and literary magazine, and we are delighted to be hosting Lois Lowry today. And as a brief introduction, Lois Lowry has written numerous novels, including The Giver Quartet and Number the Stars. And most recently, Miss Lowry wrote On the Horizon, which is a collection of poetry that talks about both World War II and her childhood on Oahu. So to start off our afternoon, Ms. Lowry will be giving a brief presentation, and then after that, we will be opening up to Q&A from the audience. So for those of you in attendance, please send through your questions through the chat. This is your opportunity to interact with us and to have any questions that you have answered. There are a number of you here today, so we probably won't be able to answer all of the questions that are submitted, but we will answer as many as we can get to. So with that said, I think we can just begin. And Miss Lowry, thank you for being here today and welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Braden. Um, you said something about good afternoon, and I'll just point out that I'm speaking to all of you from Massachusetts, where it is evening and beginning to be dark. And it's also, sorry to say, cold. So I wish I were with all of you right there on the Big Island. As Braden pointed out, I've written a lot of books, 50, I think. Haven't counted recently. And I've got one in the works right now, which isn't yet published. But what I'm going to show some pictures to give you a little autobiographical stuff, and they will be centered around my newest book that Braden mentioned, this one. When I'm finished with that, though, I am happy to answer questions about any of my books. The one that people have most often been familiar with is The Giver. That's the one that I get the most questions about. But I'm going to deal with this book, On the Horizon, first. And in order to do that, I'm going to now share the screen and go to, with my fingers crossed that everything works, go to this. Okay, there I am with my COVID hair. Having not been able to have a haircut for a very long time, but you guys know what that is like. And now I am attempting to, there we go. This will be familiar to many of you. I should put you to the test and say, raise your hand if you recognize this, except I can't see you, so I wouldn't be able to see the raised hands. This is what you see when you fly into Honolulu. And from the airport, you drive into the city, and on the left, you see this big pink hospital, Tripler Hospital. This is where I was born on March 20th, first day of spring in 1937. And there I am a year later. I am the younger one of the two, and that's my older sister, 3 years older. And I'm obviously there, just about a year old. Sometimes when I'm talking to classrooms of sixth graders or seventh graders, I'll just show them this picture and say, guess where I was born? And they all know the answer to that. This is my mom, who was a kindergarten teacher before she married. And I looked all over for a picture of her reading to me. And unfortunately, what I came up with was a picture of her reading to my sister. But I wanted to include it because it was such an important part of my childhood, the world of books that I entered when I entered that particular family. And I was so lucky to be born into a family that valued books and valued children and put the two of them together in such a meaningful way that stayed with me all my life. And here is my sister, who has begun first grade now, 6 years old, and I'm 3, and she is reading to me, and she is at the same time teaching me to read. She was my first teacher. She was my not only my sister, but my best friend, my worst enemy, my sidekick, my partner in crime, and my first teacher. I can remember how she showed me how the letters had sounds, and the sounds went together to make words, and the words went together to make stories. That's what we all learned, of course, but not most of us when I often have a picture of this book, Humphrey the Turtle, and I don't today, but I just remember the book and the fact that suddenly I knew the story. Okay, and now I could look at the words and read them, but I could see that there was something wrong with that title, with the name of the turtle, because it was supposed to be an F in the middle, and it wasn't. It was PH. And that was my introduction to the mysterious ways of American language. I have a granddaughter who learned to read in Germany, where everything is completely phonetic. And when she then learned to read in English, she found it very difficult. At any rate, enough of that. Now my pictures are stuck. There we go. All right. We all know what this headline is from. You can see the date on the New York paper. It's December 8th, 1941. And my father, the reason we were in Hawaii was my father was a military officer. And not long after the war began, he went off to the Pacific. And so my mother took the children, me and my sister, and she was expecting a baby who turned out to be my little brother. And she went back to Pennsylvania, where my grandparents lived, and that's where I spent those years of World War II. This is my father, a major at the time, and this is my grandparents' house in Pennsylvania, where we lived when I was a child and where I began school, first grade. Oh, I'd forgotten that was in here. My grandfather, when he died, left the house to the college. This was a small college town, Dickinson College. He left the house to the college, and it is now Landis House. My grandfather's last name was Landis, and it's now the Office of LGBTQ Services and Women's and Gender Resources. And I sometimes chuckle to myself and wonder how my very stuffy, pompous bank president grandfather would like that. But he might have matured and grown with the times and would be okay. At any rate, I like to think of the house being used for that now. Here I am in first grade, 6 years old. Um, I don't know why this picture is in here. And here I am with my little brother. And here I am, not I am, but here is the little town's public library, which, although I had to go to Sunday school every Sunday, couldn't have cared less about that. This was my church. From the time that I was very little, probably 6, I could walk alone to the library. And I remembered it all my life. I left that town when I was 11. But I remembered this as a cathedral. I remembered it as having 100 marble steps. And when I went back to that town as an adult to make a speech at the library, I discovered it was just 12 cement steps. But my memory is an indicator of how much that building meant to me. It had been in the town when my mother grew up there when she was a child, and somehow I came across this recently. This was the rules for that library. Back in the day when my mother was a child, books could be borrowed for 2 weeks, 2 books at a time, provided they shall not both be fiction. Patrons had to be persons above the age of 12, of cleanly habits and good reputation. I think I was under 12, but times had changed. And I think I was cleanly and had a good reputation. And that was my childhood. And now, of course, it's 1945 and the war ends. And so my life will again change. My father returns at the end of the war, but only briefly. He has to go back to Japan, where he is going to be on the staff of the hospital in Tokyo. And after a while, he notifies us that we can come to Japan and live there. Now, I'm in 1947. I have an idea in my mind of what it's going to be like. and I'm an introvert is true of me, but that's not the word I want. Um, I was not an outgoing child. I didn't tell everybody what I was thinking all the time. And so if I had told even my mother what I envisioned my life in Japan to be, she would have gently corrected me. But I didn't say anything to anybody. I just went along with what I had learned in this book in third grade, The Japanese Twins. There was a series of books by this woman, and they were all about twins. There were the Belgian twins, the Eskimo twins, the French twins, and I had read them all, loved them all, and I've gone back and found this one, which was my favorite, and reread it. And it's not that bad. Many books from that era, if you look at them again, are pretty awful and stereotyped and sexist and racist and all the things we now deplore. But this was really a pretty good portrayal of life for a Japanese child. And having read this, I assumed that this is what my life would be like. I would be wearing Japanese clothing, I would be eating with chopsticks. I would somehow magically learn to speak Japanese quickly, and I would be sleeping on the floor, and everything would be foreign and wonderful. But of course, we arrived. Here's Tokyo in 1945. Tokyo was badly bombed and burned, and it was beginning to just the early beginnings of putting itself back together by the time I arrived. And oh, I'd forgotten this picture was in here. This was a Japanese building. It was the home of the Takarazuka Theater, but the Americans took it over in 1947, named it after Ernie Pyle, who'd been a war correspondent, much loved, who was killed right at the end of the war. And so this was named for him, and it housed not only a movie theater for Americans, but also a library. And there were all the books that I left behind in Pennsylvania. All my favorites were there waiting for me in Japan. And this is the terribly ugly place where we lived. The Americans had quickly put together American-style houses, probably very cheaply built, and a reproduction of a little American town. So everything I had fantasized about was just wasn't going to happen. Now this is where we lived. That's our ugly house. There's my bike, which my father had bought to me. He picked us up Hama, drove us to Tokyo, and whispered to me at some point, "I have a surprise for you." And he had bought me a bicycle. These are the maids, of whom I was very fond. A lot of young Japanese women went to work for the Americans. They cooked our meals and did our laundry, and were greatly loved. I did not wear Japanese clothing, though I had thought I would. But this is obviously Christmas. There's a wreath on the door, and the maids dressed me in that just for a ceremony for the day. And here's my little brother. And as you know, May 5th is Boys' Day in Japan, and you hang a carp. 2 if you have 2 boys, 5 if you have 5 sons. We only had 1. And there's my bike, which figures in the book that I'm here to talk about. And this is the area of Tokyo where we lived, and where that housing development, which was called Washington Heights, very American name, and which incidentally has now all been torn down, and it's a park. Thank goodness that's all gone. I've gone back and seen where my house once stood, and it's grass now. Okay, so this is the book. I cover the book. The art is done by a man named Kennard Pack, who lives in San Francisco, and I've never met him. And when he was doing the art for this book, I got glimpses of it from time to time, emailed to me. And in the original cover that he had done, the little girl had very dark hair. Kennard Pack is Korean, and his little girl has very dark hair, but I had to ask him to change my hair to blonde because the little girl in the book is me. And in fact, her blonde hair is mentioned in the book. And so part 1 deals with Pearl Harbor. When I was born, my grandmother came from Wisconsin, where she lived. My grandmother was a Norwegian, as are most of the people in Wisconsin, even today. And so this is one of the first pieces in the book, and it says, my grandmother visited. She had come by train across the broad land from her home in Wisconsin, and then by ship. We met her and heaped wreaths of plumeria around her neck. Aloha, we said to her, welcome, hello. I called her Nani. She took me down by the ocean. The sea moved in a blue-green rhythm, soft against the sand. We played there, she and I, with a small shovel, and laughed when the breeze caught my bonnet and lifted it from my blonde hair. We played and giggled, calm, serene, and there behind us, slow, unseen, Arizona, great gray tomb, moved majestic toward her doom. I had not known that that was the case, but there I am, playing with my grandmother, and many years later, this is from an old home movie, a friend of mine who was a retired submarine commander watched my old home movies, which I had transferred to videotape, and it was he who pointed it out. And he said, there, look in the background, that's the Arizona. And as all of you know, although today's kids don't, I'm frequently explaining to them how the Arizona was a battleship that was sunk at Pearl Harbor in 1941. It carried almost 1,200 men, most of them very young. When I, as an adult, became aware of that moment when I had played laughing on the beach and behind me were young men who were soon to die, when I became aware of that, it began to haunt me. But I didn't quite know what to do with it until finally it came together in this book. And in order to do this, I looked up, I researched. So easy now with the internet. I could have done it without the internet, but it became much easier. All of those young men. I obviously couldn't write 1,200 pages and give them each a page, so I had to select individuals who were on that ship. There were 37 pairs of brothers. There was one pair of identical twins. And I selected various of them for various reasons. And I'll get to the first one in a minute. I'd forgotten this was in here. But this, as you know, is the memorial at Pearl Harbor. And you can go out on a boat and be there over the ship, looking down and seeing the bubbles that still come up from the oil that's still being released. I took a grandson of mine there when he was 11 years old. Just show you a picture. There's my grandson, age 11. He's now working on an MBA at Michigan State, so many years ago. But he and I went to Hawaii together for 10 days, and we stayed most of that time on the island of Kauai, which was a good place to be with the kid. There was a lot, he could swim and he could hike and we could do all those things. But then I told him we were going to go to Honolulu because I wanted him to see a little of this history. And he rolled his eyes and ho hum, now grandma's going to make me learn history. And we were out there and we stood in front of this wall, which has, as you know, all the names of the men on that ship. And as you can see there on the right, there were a small number of Marines who were on the ship. But at any rate, the day I was there with my grandson, Jamie, age 11, in front of this was a little glass jar with some flowers in it, and there was a note propped up in front of it, and it said, for my grandpa, and then it gave the name of the grandpa. And sorted it out in his mind and said, okay, so this guy died and he's down there in this sunken ship, but he left a child, and the child grew up and had a child, and his grandson has now left him these flowers. And you could see that it became humanized for him. Just that one little moment of the connection that he made to that child and his grandfather. And that's what I was trying to do with the men on the ship. And this was one of the ones I chose, and he's nobody out of the ordinary. None of them were. But it says James was from Missouri and had two brothers. The older boy had died in France in World War I. The youngest, out in a field bringing in the cows when a storm struck, was killed by lightning. He was 15. So James was left. He married and had two sons himself, but his wife died young, and the little boys, Jimmy and Gordon, went to live with their grandma in Seattle. It was the other grandma, widowed Mary Myers in Missouri, who opened the telegram with dread. I had bad luck with all my boys, she said. Now, you can tell that there was nothing particularly unusual about James Myers, but what struck me as I found his name and then Googled him and went back and back in time and found a newspaper interview with his mother, and she said, I had bad luck with all my boys. And that just struck me. Here's this woman who has lost all of her sons, and she's so stoic that all she says is, I had bad luck with all my boys. And so I included James Myers here. And then, after the book was published, to my amazement, I got this email, and it says, Dear Ms. Lowry, James Myers was my father, and the two little boys are my brother Jimmy and myself. Now, he and I replied to this, of course, he and I did not enter into a lifelong correspondence, so I don't know much about him. He lived in Washington. He must be in his 80s now. But I was just so moved by the connection that it made. It somehow put things together like a jigsaw puzzle. His father was on that boat. I wrote about his father. He's now an old man. He picks up a book, and there's his father. And the entire book is about those kinds of human connections. The second section moves across the Pacific and across in time, where I went to live in Tokyo. There you can see it on the map. And down to the southwest is Hiroshima. And now it's 1945. In the summers, I went south and spent summers on this island called Itajima, which is quite near Hiroshima. And here is the inland sea. I've been back there quite recently, and it seems almost unchanged. It's such a beautiful part of Japan. I know why I have this map in here. You can see Hiroshima, you can see Tajima where I was in the summers, but down here on the left is a little purple marker that I put on with my computer, and it's by a little town that nobody's ever heard of called Tabuse. And the reason that's there is because of this little boy. In a small town called Tabuse on August 5th, the summer day, a little boy, Koichi Sei, felt a shudder in the earth and saw the sky change. From Hiroshima, miles away beyond the hills beside the bay, on August 5th, a summer day, Koichi-san perceived the birth of something strange. Is this how it ends, the world, this way, on August 5th, a summer day? I'm sorry, I can't see the bottom line on my computer. I think it says it might, it may, something of that sort. But there's Koichi Sei. He was about to have his 8th birthday in August. His birthday was the August 29th. In 1945, he was soon to be 8 years old. He lived in a town 50 miles from Hiroshima, and his entire life remembered that morning. When the sky changed, he saw the light and felt the earth shake, and that's what he was seeing, the bomb go off. And this, of course, is Hiroshima immediately after that day. This is the one building still standing. I was just here not terribly long ago, and this is the museum that is there. And this is something you will see at that museum. Shinichi Tatsutani, soon 4 years old, a big boy. Shinichi Tatsutani played that morning riding his red tricycle. When his parents found him, he was still gripping the handlebar. He was so proud of his red tricycle. Shin-san, they called him. They buried him in the garden, and with him, they buried his red tricycle. He had called it his friend, Tomodachi. Later in the book, though I haven't included it here, it describes how the tricycle ended up in the museum. When the father of that child was an old man, many years later, they dug up the child's remains and transferred them to the family cemetery. And they took the tricycle and donated it to the Peace Museum, where you can see it now. So then, I included a number of other victims of the bombing, young people, mostly I focused on in this book. And then the third section moves beyond the horizon to Tokyo and back to my bicycle. And there's me, and there's my 6th grade class, and there is Koichi Sei and his 6th grade class, because he appears again in the book. I should explain that after the bomb was dropped, his mother took her 2 children. She was so terrified of what had happened and what might happen that she took her 2 children and moved north to Tokyo, and that's where he continued his childhood in Tokyo. And so this appears in the 3rd section of the book. Beside a school, I paused one day and watched some children run and play. We were curious, I know that's true. Their eyes were dark and mine were blue. I braked my bike and watched them there. I saw them eye my pale blonde hair. They looked at me and I at them. So why were we so silent, mute and shy? I smiled before I rode away, but never met Koichi Sei. Until so many years went by that he was gray-haired, so was I. I'd lived in his country then, and now he'd moved to mine. So when we met, his name was Alan now, we mused and pondered how from our horizons we had viewed a war begin, a war conclude. We were young, we were alike, a boy in a schoolyard, a girl on a bike. Here is Koichi Sei, who now goes by the name Alan Sei, and his wife. And he and I met. He's a very renowned illustrator. This is one of his best-known books. And here I am with he and his wife a couple summers ago. They live in Portland, Oregon. He and I met when his book, Grandfather's Journey, won the Caldecott Medal for Best Illustrated Children's Book in the United States in 1994. And my book, The Giver, won the Newbery Medal for the Best Written Book for Kids in the United States that year. And so we were together at the convention where those awards were to be given. And he gave me a copy of this book and signed it for me, drew a little picture of himself. And so I gave him a copy of The Giver, signed it for him, and wrote my name in Japanese. And he said, "Where did you live?" And I told him, "Tokyo." "So did I." He said, "What part of Tokyo?" "Shibuya." He said, "So did I." And then suddenly he looked at me and he said, "Were you the girl on the green bicycle?" And it was after all those years, I don't know how many, I'd have to count them up, but I'd been 12 or 11, and now we were 60 or so. And so it was many, many years. And the time had not been right that day when I stopped my bike and looked into the schoolyard at him. But now the years had passed and the time was right, and we've become close friends. So that's all the pictures I have. Hi, Alan. He has a nice smile. And I'm going to come back to join you all now here and perhaps answer questions if there are some about this book or any other books or politics or religion or whatever. Uh, I'm joking, of course. Happy to answer questions about books, writing, anything that interests you.
All right, thank you for sharing, Miss Lowry. Um, to start off, to give the attendees some time to send through their questions, both Evie and Heather have brought one question of their own to start us off with the Q&A. So while we're having the discussion for those two, everyone please send through your questions.
And just think how humiliating it will be for me if nobody has any questions.
Yeah, exactly.
You want me to go ahead with my question? All right. So, On the Horizon is done in all in poetry. How is your writing process, writing like sort of reflective memoir poetry different from writing your just like straight fiction?
Um, Part of the problem that I faced once I began to be kind of haunted by that image of the child with the ship in the background was that it didn't lend itself to a plot, which is what narrative fiction has to have. Most books, perhaps before I wrote this one, I'd probably written, I don't know, 47 or 48 books. And they take different forms. Some are historic fiction. The Giver is dystopian, but they all have one thing in common, which is that they focus on a main character, which is probably the first thing that appears in my mind when I sit down to write a piece of fiction. And the character has, well, let me describe it this way. I always start out a novel with the main character, introducing the reader to who is this story going to be about, and letting them know something about that character. But I also place the character in a situation where something, not huge, but something is awry, something is amiss, something is not quite right. And and it might be a subconscious wondering on the part of the reader, but nonetheless, the reader does have an uneasy feeling. Oh, there's something's wrong. Why is this boy frightened? The book that comes after The Giver, not a sequel but a companion volume, is called Gathering Blue. The main character is a girl. It begins, I hope I can get this correct. I don't have these here in front of me, but it begins with a little bit of dialogue. Mother, there was no answer. Kira hadn't expected one. Her mother had been dead now for 3 days. All right, you know this book is about a girl. You know her name. Very soon you'll know her age, approximately 14 or so. But you know something's wrong. She's sitting beside the body of her mother. So that's how I begin every book. But I also, at the same time, in my mind, I know what's wrong, of course, and I know how this character is going to now, from page 1 to page whatever it will be, is going to make some kind of journey, metaphorical perhaps, or even physical, to correct what was wrong, to make sense of, to figure out, to put right what has made you uneasy on the first page. Okay, so that's how I go about writing a novel. And of course, the easy part is writing that first page. And actually, the easy part is writing the last page. And the hard part is the whole middle, when you have to keep adding ingredients and making them connect in various ways. When I set out, though, to write the book On the Horizon, it came to me in the form of images. Just brief images, individual people who were not in a great, in a huge sense, they were all connected to one another, as we all are, but individually, they were not connected to each other. They didn't have a story that was going to have a narrative plot and move along toward a destination. And so that's why it began to lend itself to be written in the form that it was. the poems take different forms, and when they're a formal piece of poetry, let me give you an example. Well, I guess the easiest example is in the Hiroshima section, where one is simply a haiku, and so that is told to the reader. Of course, now I can't find it. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Well, here's a different example. This is in the Hiroshima section, and the title of the poem is Names, and this is rhyming couplets. Okay. Codenamed Little Boy, the bomb was placed aboard. The men were calm. They flew 6 hours. The skies were clear. They'd arm the bomb when they drew near. The plane was named Enola Gay. It carried a whole crew that day. George, Tom, Wyatt, Joe, Dutch, Jake, 6 hours to go. 2 Roberts, Morris, Richard, Deke. They waited, watching, didn't speak, until the order came, deploy, time to release Little Boy. At 8:15, they let it fall. The bomber pilot's name was Paul. He'd named the airplane for his mom. It carried 12 men and the bomb. 6 hours back, no talk, still none, except, my God, what have we done? So that's a very simple rhyming form. Unlike some of the others that are more complex, there is a kind of poem called triolet, which is a very complex form, and that's used at the end of each section. But at any rate, I was just simply describing how the pieces of the book came to me in my consciousness as fragments and as images, and that's why I ended up using that form as opposed to the long narrative with chapters and suspense and characters and dialogue and setting and all those things you learn about in writing classes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm currently student teaching 9th grade English this year, and we had a section on frequently challenged books. The students were initially excited to review the list, but the conversation soon turned incredulous, disbelief even, when they saw The Giver was one of the books on the list, as they pinpointed that as one of their absolute favorites. Would you please discuss your feelings on making the ALA most frequently challenged book list?
Well, I'm a has-been on that list because The Giver was for about 10 years on the list of 10 most challenged books. But then it fell off the list because many books came along. Well, for example, let me back up. The Giver was described by a number of critics and book reviewers as the first dystopian novel for young people. Now, I'd majored in writing and literature in college and had to read the classic dystopian novels, Brave New World, 1984, even Animal Farm. But those were written for adults, and apparently The Giver was the first one written for kids. But once it became so immensely popular, which it did almost immediately, of course, a lot of other people began writing dystopian novels for young people. And one that comes to my mind is The Hunger Games. Okay? It's a good book, kids love it. But that book is about children murdering each other, kids killing other kids. The Giver is very tame fare compared to that. And so it's declined in unpopularity. No, I shouldn't say that. It's always been popular. It's declined in unsavoriness, and is no longer challenged the way it once was. But when that happened, for those 10 years, it always took me by surprise because for one thing, I don't think the process is generally parents coming to a school and saying, my kid had to read this book and it's a terrible book, I want you to take it out of the curriculum. And then there's a process that goes through. And one thing that's required in that process is that the parent has to read the book. And often they haven't done so. The kid has sometimes brought the book home and said, look, this book has a bad word in it. And then the parent says, let's ban this book. In the case of The Giver, often I think the parents, and incidentally, The Giver has no bad words in it. Other of my books do, but The Giver does not. But often the parents were quite shocked at two scenes in particular in The Giver. And frequently it was found that they hadn't read the book. One scene that shocked them, which did not appear in the movie, by the way, was in the book. For those who haven't read it, the children in the book, when they're, well, at every age, are required to do volunteer work in various parts of the community. And the boy, the 12-year-old protagonist, is doing his volunteer hours working in what they call the House of the Old. And so you see him go there one afternoon after school for his volunteer hours, and he is bathing a very old woman. And she's in the bathing room where there are tubs and there's steam and warm water, and he's sitting beside the tub with a sponge and washing her shoulders and talking to her. And they have a very tender conversation. There's nothing in any way sexual about the scene, but some parents were shocked by boy with naked woman. I always found it a very touching scene, but the movie makers decided to leave it out because they didn't want the movie to be banned. The other scene, which shocked parents, is the scene in which the boy's father kills a baby, an infant. What troubled me often when that scene was held up as a reason that the book should be banned, it was often described as a scene promoting euthanasia. And of course it isn't. And that's an example of people not reading a book carefully before they bring the objection. At any rate, it happened many, many times for about 10 years, and there were some towns. One was Holland, Michigan. I don't know anything about Holland, Michigan, except that it has a lot of tulips and apparently has a large Dutch population. I have to go and myself and my book. But it's sad to say, book banning has not subsided. It's just that other books and other authors are the victims of it now.
All right, thank you.
Can I tell you one more thing? It just occurred to me.
Yeah.
I don't know the date of this, but in the late 1930s, prior to our entry into World War II, but when Hitler was coming to power in Germany, there was a great book banning in Munich. Not banning, excuse me. There was a book burning in which many books were deemed offensive and I can't think of the word, but at any rate, they were literally burned in a great fire. I happened to be in Munich with my husband a couple of years ago. That place where the books had been burned. And on the date when that happened, he said, there is now a ceremony and people volunteer, and he was one of the volunteers, and all day long they stand there one after another and they read aloud from the books that were burned that day, which include Hemingway and others with whom we're very familiar now. But anyway, it's, as I sometimes point out to kids who write to me because often an assignment in school to talk about or think about or write about book banning and censorship. And I often point out to them that book banning is one of the earliest stages, always, of a fascist regime. It's a very dangerous thing. Okay, I'll shut up.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
About the rituals they're doing now.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to start taking questions from the audience. First one we have here is from an anonymous attendee. They ask, were Barnaby A and Barnaby B from the Willoughbys inspired at all by your early reading about twins?
Interesting. Those explain it's a humor, but it's about a family with terrible, and two of them twins, and these are so unparental that bothered to think of two separate names. Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. On Sundays, you can fight over it. So it's just an example of what terrible parents they are in order to justify the fact that at the end of the book, the kids have gotten rid of the parents. But the question is whether my early reading about twins influenced that. I think it's probably more influenced by the fact that I have two sets of grand twins, and my brother has grand twins, and it's been my observation that this could be entirely misinformation, but it seems to me there are more twins recently than there used to be, because I'm seeing a lot of them, and I even have two friends who have triplet grandchildren. So I think that's why twins came to my mind writing that book, which is also an animated film on Netflix now, but the film has very similarity to the book.
All right, so let's move on to our next audience question from Ariel Moniz. What are some moments in your books or in the writing process that really moved you or are still memorable for you?
Interesting. The Giver is the first of 4 books that are now called the Giver Quartet. And the first book, Jonas is the main character, but there's also a baby whose name is Gabriel. And I don't have time to describe everything, but at the end of that book, Jonas takes that baby, kidnaps that baby, I guess you could say, and leaves the community in order to save the life of the baby. 3 books later, in the 4th and final book, I began to write it using Gabriel 14 years later as the main character, now a teenage boy. And the problem he was facing, the uneasiness he was causing at the beginning, is depicted in dialogue. He's talking to Jonas, who is now a grown man, and he's asking about his own origins. And Jonas is having a hard time explaining to him because the methodology of child production in the first book was so bizarre. Girls are assigned the task of birth mothers. They're artificially inseminated. They give birth to babies who are immediately taken away and assigned to a family. And he'd been one of those babies, but he had not been assigned because he had not been developing quickly enough. So in that dialogue, Gabriel says to Jonas, who was my mother? Didn't she want me? And he has a hard time explaining that. But when I was writing that dialogue, which was to begin the book, I suddenly began to think myself, who was that mother? Who was his mother? Who was that young girl? And so I rewrote the beginning and changed the book around completely. And the book now begins with a young girl, 14 years old, with a mask strapped over her face so she can't see what's happening, in pain. Things aren't going well, and eventually she's anesthetized and she can feel them, she says in her mind, carving her. And they remove a baby, and she's been given a cesarean section. And the baby is taken away. Okay, so that begins the book. But what concludes that first chapter is her yearning and longing for that baby, wondering where he is. And she knows that it's a male. She wasn't supposed to know that, but somebody let it slip, so she knows she has given birth to a son. The name of the book is Son. And the entire book is about her 14 years of searching for this lost child. And I guess I mentioned that when the question was asked, because what came to my mind was the fact that I had lost a son. One of my sons had died in an accident. And I think I've always carried that along with me. Not that I'm searching for my son, but the feeling of a missing son. I do remember, though, that when I was beginning to write that book, and I lived in Maine, it was Labor Day weekend in September, where in Maine, not in Hawaii, but in Maine, it's beginning to get chilly. There was a family from Massachusetts camping in northern Maine in a state park with their 2 children, a little girl about 10 and a boy about 4. And as they were packing to leave at the end of the weekend, they couldn't find the little boy. He had ridden off on his little plastic tricycle away from their campground, and they found the tricycle and they did not find the little boy. So park rangers came in, the state police came in, sniffer dogs came in, helicopters came in. It was in all the papers where I lived, and it kept showing a picture of this little boy who looked so much like my little boy, blonde, blue-eyed. His name was Kurt, I remember. And the days passed, and the weather got colder, and it began to be below freezing at night. And finally, they had to stop searching. And those parents had to pack up that car and go home. And I remember thinking, how could you leave that place? How could you ever sleep again? And it was not so much the loss of the son, which I had suffered, but it was the not knowing. And so that's what came to my mind when you asked the question. That pervasive feeling of loss that propelled the narrative plot of that book. It was hard to fill 14 years with that search. And so the book is in 3 sections as she moves from place to place. And of course, the book concludes with her reunion with her son.
Well, now we're all moved, I think. Definitely am. Thanks for that.
Got another?
Yeah, and Heather's going to be delivering the next one.
Okay, so from an anonymous attendee, what was the research process like for you on the Horizon? How long did it take? What was it like interacting with real individual stories?
Well, it's relevant that you said it that way, with real individual stories, because I did not interact with individuals that I recall. It was reading about them. And as I mentioned, I started out on the internet. There are sites that list the names of those young men who were on that ship. And then from there, as you do with the internet, you go from this place to that place. There are also books which I acquired, And so most of, I guess all the research, I don't recall talking to any individuals. Of course, so few of them would still be around. So it was all through books, and one thing leading to another. It's always like some kind of scavenger hunt. You get a glimpse of something, and then you try to find out more about it, and you do it however you can. It did take a long time, and it was also messy. And my desk was piled with books. I've just finished writing a book that's set in the first century, the Iron Age. And talk about research. Again, my desk is piled with books, and it's fun doing that part. At some point, of course, you have to quit reading and quit questioning and start writing. So it's a long process. I think it probably took me about a year to do this particular book.
All right, thank you. And our next question is from Shine Lee. Shine asks, how does Miss Lowry feel about the movie making process for The Giver, and how much of a hand were you allowed to have in it?
I There have been 4 movies made of my books, and a movie of Number the Stars is in the beginning stages now. And in 1, 2, 3, in 3 of them, and Number the Stars, I have no interaction whatsoever. That's been their choice. With The Giver, Jeff Bridges bought the rights to The Giver many years ago. I don't know if you remember his father, Lloyd Bridges, who was an actor. And Jeff bought it because he wanted to direct a movie, which he had never done, and star his father. And he saw the picture of the old man on the cover, and it attracted his attention. And he read it, and he bought the rights to make the film. But then, of course, filmmaking involves raising a lot of money and getting wealthy studio producers involved. And he just could never put it all together. And then his father died. But by the time his father died, he realized he was old enough to play the role of the old man. So it continued on. But that process was, gosh, I don't know, 15 years perhaps. And along the way, he and I talked from time to time. We did not actually ever, at that point, meet in person. We talked on the phone. And then finally, everything fell into place, and he was to star, but by now somebody else was directing, and it was all being put together. And they began to email me with questions and telling me what was going on. It was kind of surprising because that doesn't usually happen. The author is usually set aside. And they began asking me small questions about small things. I remember one was they were designing the set, and they sent me an email that said, what would the boys' bedroom look like? What would be in the boys' bedroom? And so I said, well, of course, there'd be a bed and something to hold his clothing, and there would be a desk for him to do his homework. I said, but there's nothing decorative. I said, if you want something on the wall, it would have to be something educational, maybe the periodic table of elements. And I was surprised when finally they invited me to come and watch them filming, and they showed me the set of and there was the periodic table of elements. However, one of my grandsons at the time was about 12, and I told him that story. And he said, what year is this taking place? And I said, I don't know, maybe it's 30 years from now. He said, let's say 2050. And he said, well, there won't be any more helium. And he said, there will be new elements. So I said, okay. So it's a bad table of elements, but on the boys' bedroom. But I just tell you that as an example of how they did include me in small ways. They also brought me out to Los Angeles to meet the boy who was going to play the main role. And while I was there, they had me look at some of the costume designs. I remember I vetoed one dress that they were designing for the girl protagonist because it was a little too sexy looking and she was supposed to be completely asexual. I did ask them, well, when they told me that the protagonists, who are 12 in the book, were going to be older, I groaned, but I said, okay, and they explained why, and I can tell you that, and there was legitimate reasons. But I said, but please don't turn it into a romance. And they said they wouldn't, but they lied, because there is a kiss. If you've seen the movie, you know. I was there on the set when that kiss took place, and the girl playing Fiona lives in Los Angeles, but she's Israeli, actually, and her father, who didn't speak very good English, but he was there with her on the set. And later she said to me, that's the first time I ever kissed a boy, and my father was watching. I shouldn't tell that story about her. She's older now and grown up. But at any rate, they did include me and asked me questions and asked my opinion, and a couple times asked me to rewrite some lines. And I did sit in the room when Meryl Streep dubbed her own voice, and watched that, and it was interesting and fun to watch. But here's what happened, I think. In the book, a lot of what happens within the consciousness of the boy, within his head and his heart, if you will. And so you can be inside the boy, and you can't do that in a movie. So they have to show everything, because they can't portray the inner feelings unless they do a really stupid voiceover kind of thing. And so they have to add action. And so the book doesn't have a lot of action. I could have done without the car chase, but somehow they felt that a movie needed a car chase, and so there it is. One thing I thought was better in the movie, and the movie was able to do better. In the book, the boy has kind of visions as he acquires the memories that are given to him. He experiences them. And toward the end, when he's going to run away, the giver, the old man, Jeff Bridges, says, excuse me, I'm just smiling because I'm remembering something about Jeff Bridges, and I'll try to remember to tell it to you. But at any rate, Jeff Bridges, the giver, says to him, I'm going to give you one last memory of courage and strength to take with you when you go. And so in the book, it describes what I haven't reread it recently, so I don't remember exactly how it describes it. But in the movie, they showed what the boy received then, and it was kind of I don't know what you call it, not a montage of various scenes. And one is Nelson Mandela out in the streets of South Africa in Cape Town, where incidentally the movie was filmed. And one is the young man standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square. And it's a very moving moment. I got choked up watching it, and I couldn't do that in the book. So that, I think, was one example of how the movie can do something better. But I'll just tell you what I was laughing at, remembering Jeff Bridges. I said that I had never met him, just talked to him on the phone, and then they flew me to South Africa where they were making the movie. And when I got there, I checked into my hotel, and they were making the scene, working on the scene in the auditorium of the ceremony. And so that's what I went and watched. And I also watched the scene where the father kills the baby and the girl kisses the boy. But none of those scenes had Jeff Bridges in them. In the ceremonial scene, he was up on the stage, but I had not yet met Jeff Bridges, okay? And so he and I were to have dinner. We were to meet for dinner that evening. This was going to be the first time that we actually met in person. And during the day, there was a knock on my hotel room door, and it was a hotel attendant who was, when I opened the door, she was giggling, kind of laughing. And she handed me a bouquet of flowers, and I said thank you, and closed the door, wondering why she was laughing. And then I read the note. And it said something like, after all this time, we're finally going to do it. Jeff Bridges. Sorry.
That was pretty good. All right.
He's a nice man.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Miss Lowry. We have hit the 2 o'clock hour, and we don't want to keep you too late since we know it's later over there than in Hawaii.
It's dinner time here.
Yeah, it's dinner time. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. It was wonderful to meet you, and I appreciate your time so much.
Thank you. It was fun for me. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.